From the University at Buffalo School of Social Work, welcome back to the In Social Work podcast. I'm Peter Sabota. It's good to have you along, everybody. In case you haven't noticed, there's been a movement toward the structured use of psychedelic substances based on studies and clinical trials studying the benefits to mental health and treatment of substance abuse, especially when it's accompanied by psychotherapy. Further proof of whatever's old is new again, the use of psychedelics is on the increase in the United States. Perhaps the awareness of clinical trials checking out the therapeutic benefits might result in increasing numbers of people who will try psychedelics on their own for the very first time. Of course, human beings have been seeking ways to alter their consciousness for a long time. Users of psychedelics often report positive experiences while using them, but clearly there are risks. And further, while cannabis has become increasingly legal and regulated, people who are using psychedelics outside of those guardrails are trying it sometimes for the first time without the safeguards that legalization, education, and regulation provide. Our guest today is Dr. Daniel Kruger, and he gets it. He and his colleagues dared to study and develop a harm reduction resource to facilitate safe and beneficial psychedelic experiences outside of clinical and research settings. And even more interesting, I think, he went to the psychedelic community and surveyed practical recommendations from people who have been using psychedelics. Recommendations for first-time and experienced users. Today, he'll talk about what he had to overcome and what he and his colleagues have learned. Whether they know it or not, social workers currently work and will work with clients who are using psychedelics regardless of the settings they work in. Dr. Kruger will tailor his comments to the implications for social work, including ethics, assessment, research, and education. Daniel Kruger, PhD, works with the Department of Community Health and Health Behavior, the School of Public Health and Health Professions at the University at Buffalo, and the Michigan Psychedelics Center at the University of Michigan Medical School. Dr. Daniel Kruger, welcome to In Social Work.
It's great to talk with you, Peter.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it, Dan. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this. So you are asking some really interesting questions in your latest study, and I'm only going to imagine that you are getting, or it's possible you're going to get some flack for even asking those questions. We can talk about that later. But today we're going to discuss what you learned about best practices for folks who are having their first psychedelic experiences, and even better, harm reduction advice from the psychedelic community. Wow, you went big.
Yeah, I appreciate your recognition of that.
Well, I think when you do creative, innovative work, I think that's kind of what happens. Open minds sometimes are not always embraced. So before we get into the work specifically, I'm just really curious, briefly, how did you how did you end up studying this topic?
Sure. Well, this was not something that was a topic of study, when I went to college or graduate school. It just was not
Right.
not on the radar at all. And I went into two primary areas. One was psychology, and then especially trying to integrate psychology into the life sciences. So basically taking a very deep theoretical approach, understanding human evolution and how that shaped our psychology and behavior. And, did very, very, deep theoretical work, which, I still find fascinating.
Mhm.
And then I also did a lot of work on the very other end of the spectrum, applied community-based work. I trained with a community psychologist, and we did projects that were designed to directly benefit the communities that we were involved with. In fact,
Wow.
when I was in graduate school and working on this, um, I think my professor was tenured. I mean, she had kids, she might have had other priorities. Uh, we didn't even really follow up so much on the academic aspects of this. These were
Hmm.
all projects where we were doing something that, was helping the community, and we were collaborating with a school or a neighborhood organization or a small nonprofit to do very applied research, survey research and program evaluation. And that, that gave me my, community-based collaborative background. And then later on in my career, I, took a position in public health
Mm,
where it was community-based collaborative research. So I had the research skills, and I had conducted health research before, but it was everything from school to work programs to neighborhood conditions and such. So um, so this brought me into the world of public health. And to make a long story short, it was a culture shock for me. One, being trained in other areas, going to, being in public health and going to public health conferences, and and particularly in how substances were treated.
yeah.
And there's a huge need and there's a huge investment, for this kind of work. And there is a lot of research on, all the harms of tobacco and all the harms of alcohol. I understand that, but there really wasn't.
The legal problems, right?
Well, the legal substances,
Substances,
the
right?
ones that
Yeah, yeah.
you can walk into a store and buy, no problem. But there wasn't much differentiation between substances,
Mm,
and there were a few things that really caught my attention. One was that a lot of it was really sophisticated in some ways that the research was done, like the data were collected, but then they would just dump all the data into a correlation matrix and say, oh, well, look at all these things that cannabis use correlates with. And there were presentations that were even following the gateway drug approach, which, even by then I knew had been debunked.
right.
And I would say to these people, like, okay, well, you're literally saying that, cannabis use is leading to these other much riskier behaviors, but even in your own study, 85% of the people who said they use cannabis aren't doing this other thing. So,
Right.
it's these 15% that are, and that's what's driving this relationship. Um, but also, I mean, understandably, just because of the whole, social climate and, the war on drugs and, the Nancy Reagan, just say no era,
Yeah.
it was an abstinence only approach. And, I see the value of these programs in the sense that, there's certain populations that, we wouldn't want to be using cannabis or psychedelics. Uh,
Sure.
if you're young and you're 13 years old and your brain is still developing, if you're pregnant or if you're going to be, driving vehicles, there are risks, but, at the same time, at that time, this is, a dozen years ago or so, California, Oregon, and Colorado had created medical cannabis programs.
Right.
So then millions of adult Americans had legal access to cannabis, and they were using it to treat anything and everything, right? So I would go up to these presenters and I would say this. I would say, well, I see what you're doing here, and this has value, but what about these medical cannabis programs and the adults who are using cannabis? What's the public health framework for that? And
And
well, the reaction was like deer in the headlights. Like people were stunned. Most of them couldn't process the phrase medical cannabis. Like, um, I got some dirty looks even. Uh,
sure. Yeah.
but
Me too. Mhm.
the best answer I got was, well, we don't know enough about that. And it's like, well, I mean, what do you do if there's a critical issue and you don't know enough about it? I mean, the way I was thinking, it was like legalized cannabis is like a freight train coming down the tracks, and the field is standing on the tracks, and they're just going to get completely run over if all they have is an abstinence model. And pretty soon, half of America is going to have, legal access to cannabis, right?
Yeah.
So, I said to my wife, I'm like, well, because she is actually trained, in health education, her degrees are in public health. And I was like,
Mm.
is this really the way the field is? Like, this is crazy. Like, and she's like, yeah, that's pretty much it.
They're
So
not
it's like,
alone, to be fair, though. I think medicine and psychology and even social work, they were slow on the uptake with this stuff too.
Yeah, no, it really is something that emerged in
Hmm.
recent decades. Even in the 1990s, in the Clinton years, um, it was pretty controversial when California was, implementing its medical cannabis program, 1996, I believe. So, uh, yeah, so it's understandable, but I was like, this is crazy. Somebody has to do something about this. Somebody has to do something about this. And then after about the third conference where I had the same experience, I was like, all right, I guess it's us. You know,
Yeah.
we have to do something about this because nobody else is.
Yep.
And later on, so we basically we did some very very basic surveys of cannabis users, and fortunately we were able to reach them because at the time I was at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and Ann Arbor has an event called Hash Bash where the cannabis users come to the university campus,
Yep.
and there's literally thousands on the quad, which is called the diag, and it's like, well, that's where we get our survey population. So,
There you go.
so that it was before, really before, we were doing online surveys. So it's like, how are we going to reach people? How are we going to get people to talk about, their illegal behaviors? What's going to happen? Are people going to get mad at us? Are they going to accuse us of something, or is the campus police going to try to kick us off campus? Because this was not an event the university really liked.
Yeah.
There were several times where they really did try to shut it down. But the students won out on the free speech argument, so it's officially
Hmm.
sponsored by a student organization. And it kept happening. So, and honestly, we were thrilled. It worked out really well. People were very interested and curious. Um, and honestly, I'm a survey researcher by training, and
Hmm.
I have had on the ground grassroots survey research experience walking around Chicago neighborhoods on a NIDA drug study. So, ringing buzzers and knocking on doors and trying to get people to tell me all the different kinds of drugs that they used. So I had real world experience with survey research, and I knew, like, okay, what we're actually going to be able to accomplish going to an event where many people are actually going to be on high on cannabis. They're not going to, we're not going to be able to use the same kind of like 36 item psychological measures that we might for, the introductory psychology subject pool, or
Hmm.
the bread and butter of most academic psychology research, right? But, we were able to craft a survey that got a lot of information and just a little time from participants, and we're able to publish a couple papers on it.
Yeah.
So very, very, very thrilled about that. And honestly, it was only when we were actually submitting our manuscripts to some certain journals, like even then, there's just like a handful of journals that would even consider
Touch it. Yeah.
considering this. That's when we learned about, oh, there's like a handful of other people in the world, like Philippe Lucas in Canada, some other folks who are actually interested in this type of approach and taking this broader, maybe even towards like harm reduction perspective. So,
Yes.
and then honestly, cannabis research has just boomed from there. So
Right.
I like to think that we got in, pretty early, and we're still active in it, because we work closely with the community. We find out what's going on, and we tend to know, like, what are the trends and what are the big things happening in the cannabis world. So I like to think that we're still on the leading edge
Yeah.
of cannabis research. But
And yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, but it's a huge field now. There's just so much cannabis research going on now,
Yeah.
compared to even like 5 years ago. I'll segue into psychedelics, but you have a question you want to ask?
Yeah, no, it's more of a comment in some ways is that I think it's what's one of the big reasons I wanted to talk with you is because you went and talked to and collaborated with the people who use the substance, right?
Right.
And so I think the U.S. household survey of alcohol and other drugs has been, I think, publishing their results, I think, every 2 years. They've been very clear about the number of people who have been using drugs and, recreationally, drugs that they're not supposed to be able to be using recreationally, or who have practiced their own version of harm reduction quite successfully. So we have kind of known that this is what people do and are able to do it pretty successfully. And I just think it's great that you and your colleagues are actually collaborating and listening to them. Um, and I'm sure you know better than I, the caveat is when you walk into the harm reduction realm, and then start talking about it or training or doing research, you get accused of promoting drug use, which
Mhm.
is, that's such a lame pushback on the whole thing. The
Well,
other
there's
thing,
research on that.
yeah,
There's
yeah.
research on that showing that harm reduction efforts do not lead to, increased substance use or to novel substance use. And,
Hmm.
that's in the literature. So we've cited that in some of our papers. Uh, but yeah, and then honestly, I really think that it's been building, right? The interest in psychedelics has been building, but I really think that when Michael Pollan came out with his book, How to Change Your Mind,
Bestseller, by the way.
that
Yeah.
was like the watershed moment where
Hmm.
the American intelligentsia was talking about psychedelics again.
Hmm.
Because there have been other books by,
Hmm.
other even prominent people. But Michael Pollan, he's just, such a great writer and such a well-respected writer. And he's had a series of books, that people have loved. So when he wrote a book, it's just going to get a lot of attention. And it was a pretty glowing account, right? So
It was, yeah.
that was kind of like the cue where it's like, okay, well, we've got to do this with psychedelics too, because this is going to be the next big thing. So we launched our psychedelic projects, and I lead what I call the psychedelic community survey, which when it was launched, it was the largest survey of psychedelic users at the time, and we continue to work on new topics every year. So so that's how we got into it. And then also we feel like we were kind of on the leading edge in terms of like large scale research on psychedelics, but it's also an area where psychedelic research is booming, and it's difficult to to keep up with. But to tell you the truth, when we started, there was a lot of investment already in psychedelic research, but it tended to be in clinical trials,
Exactly.
where
Yeah.
pharmaceutical companies wanted to bring products to market, in neuroscience, and by that I mean like brain scan research, fMRI and other ways to scan your brain and see what's going on, and that's fascinating. It's really fascinating stuff, and I like this idea of the Bayesian brain, where you have these top-down processes, and then you have your
Mm.
bottom-up information coming in, and the psychedelics tune down the top-down processes. I mean, it's fascinating work. But it's in a different sort of realm. And then there's all these studies with rodents, which I wouldn't even get into, because they kind of disturb me, to tell you the truth. But there really wasn't the kind of like research with humans, other than how many people are taking these substances, right?
Hmm.
So that was where the gap was, and we basically wanted to fill that gap and basically say, like, what do we need to know if we want to have a holistic approach, to cannabis or psychedelics? What would you want to have in place if you were to treat psychedelics like they were food or medicine? All the different, what would you want to know? How would you want to regulate them? How do you keep people safe? How do you protect people? How do you minimize the costs, risks, and harms? And then I know this is even more controversial, but how do you also maximize the benefits?
Yes,
Oh,
yes, I was waiting. I was going to throw that in if you
yeah.
didn't,
So,
because that's kind of the whole thing with harm reduction, right? You want to reduce, negative outcomes. That's the like low-hanging fruit. But I really like what you've addressed in terms of and daring to address that. What about also looking that beyond that, that these are experiences that people value, they find it beneficial, and dare go, I think you should say it, therapeutic.
Yeah, well, we're seeing that in the clinical trials. I mean, the pharmaceutical companies think that this is going to be the next big thing in psychiatry.
Mm,
So people people are aware of this now. I mean, people with resources and power. But it is a big shift for these fields. It is a big shift for these fields, and to understand these perspectives, I understand that so many people were trained in the drug war era and were trained at a time where, I mean, I literally, when I was in high school, there was a health class with a section on drugs, and there was like this matching exercise with all the drugs, and the correct answer was cannabis is the gateway drug.
right.
And I knew enough to write, to match that as the correct answer, but I knew it was false. It was like, I know this is what they're telling us, but you know, and also, to give people, a little more understanding. Um, there's often complaints about ivory tower academics,
Yep.
people who are elite, elite or removed from what's going on. And I think a lot of people who work in these areas, I mean, they're motivated because, they want to help people, they want to improve
Mhm.
conditions, but they're not the ones who partied in college, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of folks, even those who research these substances, don't seem to really have any personal experience or even like one
Mhm.
or two degrees of separation, from what's going on in the real world. So it's
Yeah.
understandable that you have this big gap and you have this big divide of, folks who are really from different cultures. But, of course, that creates problems, when you want to, normalize something, regulate something, and protect people's health, because you have to have a real and deep understanding of what is actually happening and what is actually going on.
Hmm. I think also some of that, in addition to what you just said, some of that work I think is complicated by what I think I would call the writing reflex. That is kind of, I think, a almost like a hallmark of people who are in the helping professions. We see a problem, we want to alleviate it, we want to make it better, and there's nothing wrong with that in many ways, but at the same time, it really prevents us from listening to the people who have had the lived experience and valuing the experiences they had with an open mind. Um, I'm always struck in these conversations how people forget that I'm pretty sure that human beings as a species have been seeking to alter their consciousness since they were aware that they had consciousness. So this is kind of something that's innately human and certainly goes wrong for many people, causes them problems. But I really like the fact that we're getting slightly more open minded about what constitutes health and living with the costs and the potential risks and also the benefits of these substances. So kudos to your work. Now, the paper that you just wrote, the people who are the article I think was focused on folks who were having some of their first experiences with psychedelics.
Well, it
Um,
was it was going to the psychedelic community
right, right.
and asking them to give advice for people who are having their first experiences with psychedelics. So everyone in the survey, everyone participating in the survey had experiences with full doses of psychedelics, but
Gotcha.
we're asking them, like, what recommendations would you have for someone using for the first time? Um,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of knowledge in the psychedelic community, but
Absolutely.
it's largely underground,
Yep.
And there is advice out there, right? Set and setting, right? But that's something it's understood by the psychedelic community. It's understood by people who already have these experiences, but not so much by people who have never had any kind of experience. Like set and setting, what does that mean? Is that like a tea
Mhm.
set and a table setting? Uh, Surrender to the void. Okay, what does that mean? Like, okay, how do I surrender to the void? People, these are things that might resonate with people who have experience, but how do you start? Like, how would you even have your first experience for those who
Mhm.
are contemplating it? So that was our approach, to get really practical, usable advice for people who are using psychedelics for the first time. And I would say, I mean, and part of the importance of that is, yeah, there are risks. There are risks
Yeah,
and
of
possible
course.
harms.
Yeah. So I'm curious, how did you find these folks?
Well, we have connections in the community. We have I have collaborators. I have collaborators who work as psychedelic therapists and are
Hmm.
involved in psychedelic organizations. And fortunately, there was also another event in Ann Arbor called EntheoFest,
What
right?
was that? Say that
It's
again.
called EntheoFest for entheogens.
Ah,
So Ann Arbor, it's just like the archetypal college town, very, very progressive. It's probably one of the most progressive places.
hmm.
It's kind of like Ithaca in a way, in between the coasts of being this very, very, very progressive place. Uh,
Hmm.
and it was actually the city council who led the deprioritization of psychedelic law enforcement, so decriminalization.
Wow.
And because Ann Arbor, is a college town, education is very central. They declared that September was going to be Entheogen Awareness Month,
Nice.
and they used the term
You don't see a
entheogen.
lot of posters like that, but I like
Yeah.
that.
Well, actually, I think there were some in Ann Arbor, like on the lamppost, because it was an official thing. It was an
Of
official
course.
thing,
Yeah.
and they declared that there was going to be an educational event to coincide with this that was going to be called EntheoFest. So when we saw that opportunity, we're like, okay, well, we have to be there. So that's another place where we've recruited people. So we use a variety of means. We basically try to we use these social networks. We go online, and even my colleagues who are more active in like Facebook groups and such, they'll post to different Facebook groups that are uh,
Hmm.
of folks who might have an interest. And we basically just try to get people however we can to take our online survey, and then we ask them if they would like to be recontacted, for future research.
Yeah.
So we have a completely separate survey. So the surveys, they're all anonymous. Like there's no
Uh-huh.
identifying information. We even scrub the metadata, so there's no like IP addresses or anything in there.
Hmm.
Um, but we have a second survey where we just collect people's email addresses. It's not linked to their data, but then we can recontact them, and gradually we'll build that list over time. But it is a challenge. It's like, how do you, how do you even get participants to participate in
Hmm.
something like this? That's challenge number one.
Yep. And so like I know this is a tough question, but in a nutshell, and we can talk more, we can tease it out a little more as we start talking, but what did you learn after you
Mhm.
talked with these folks?
Yeah, well, a lot of interesting you know advice.
Hmm.
We have a lot of different ways to digest the information. So folks did talk about the importance of mental preparation. So you have to prepare for the experience, learn about the psychedelic experiences and substances you're taking in advance beforehand. Set intentions for what you want to accomplish through the experience. Um, clear time both before and after for preparation and recovery. So build in like at least one day to recover in your schedule. Um, and also when you're going through the experience, embrace the experience and whatever you encounter in your journey. Um, because people do have difficult and challenging times. Um, prepare for these anxieties and challenges. Know that whatever you're feeling, will go away eventually. But people like Bill Richards. He has decades of work. He was involved in the first, or the mid-century, mid 20th century, psychedelic research and therapy.
Hmm.
Um, so he has lots and lots of experience, guiding people in legal settings. And he likes to say to confront these fears. Like if you see a demon, ask that demon, like, who are you? What are you about? Why are you here? And then understand it and go through it. We have a study on the challenging experiences that people can have with psychedelics. And what we find is that most people, at least some of the time, do experience things like anxiety or depressive symptoms or the feeling that this might go on forever. And it's not like all the time. It's not all, it's all during their psychedelic experience, but most people do actually have these challenges, at least at times. And then there's some people who have even more extensive challenges. And then there's some people, a minority, but I mean, even one case, I think is, substantial. There are, small proportion of people who have persisting challenges long after the acute effects of the psychedelics are gone. So that's something that we were aware of and we want people to know about,
Hmm.
and we want to help them, navigate through those experiences. And we're hoping that, I mean, one of the values of going to the psychedelic community and getting this advice is that people will trust it more. You know,
Yep.
if they hear, these anti-drug messages that they later find out were false, then they're not going to trust the information, right? But by getting information from the community and sharing that, we hope that people will have more trust in it when we say, you do have to watch out. Here are some challenges, here are difficulties that people have. So educate yourself, be informed of it, and here are some things that you can do about it.
Yep. There's a certain degree also, I think, of myth busting here that I really like in what you're studying. I mean, even when you were talking about the mental prep, that sounds like very responsible behavior, right? People are thinking this through. And the, kind of like the conventional wisdom is people who are using, psilocybin or acid, they're not thinking it through. Well, hold on here. Wait a minute. So, what I also really liked about your study was that the users who you spoke to obviously spoke, pretty positively about the experiences they had, but once again, they also discouraged the use of certain substances and actually gave you recommendations, specific combinations of drug use for inexperienced users. So they're kind of this is exceedingly thoughtful,
Mhm.
and I just love the fact that you were able to document that.
Yeah, no, I'm glad. I'm glad to hear it. I should also mention, we talked about set and setting before, so the
Yep.
the mental preparation, that's part of the mindset. You also want to really carefully cultivate your setting, your environment. So
Hmm.
one of the strongest things that people said was, be with people that you trust.
Yeah.
Be with people that you care about, that they care about you. Even people that you love. A lot of people even said, have a guide or a sitter,
Hmm.
someone to be there.
Keep you
Sometimes,
safe. Yeah.
yeah, and sometimes not on psychedelics themselves.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and be in a safe, familiar, and comfortable location. Some people like to go into nature, but
Hmm.
also have things on hand that could help facilitate your experience. So make sure you have water, hydration, music that you enjoy listening to, comfortable clothing and blankets, even a little snacks, eye masks if you want them. So a lot of
Hmm.
really specific advice for, things that might be useful, during this experience. And then also, things that you shouldn't do. So like don't drink alcohol beforehand. Don't eat too much beforehand.
Yeah.
Have a plan in case an emergency arises. What would you actually do? So yeah, so educate yourself, prepare, and hopefully this would ameliorate most of the issues that could arise.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking back to when, before I was an academic, I was a practitioner and I worked in outpatient chemical dependency settings. And I was also I learned a ton because I spoke with people, I think like you, who were using drugs. And unfortunately, many of the people who I ended up talking to were people who had gotten into trouble with them, obviously. But even from them, and even with some of the people who I met, for example, at AA and NA meetings, were very conversant with the so-called non-academic literature, for example, like the writings of Carl Jung and the writings of William James, who wrote the varieties of religious experiences. And I believe it was Bill White, who I believe was the kind of the architect of AA, who I think was an LSD advocate, but at the time kind of had to keep that under wraps. So the fact that people have been using
Oh,
the
Bill Wilson.
Bill
Bill
Wilson, what did I
Wilson
say?
was
Bill
such an
White, yeah.
advocate.
Bill Wilson.
Bill
Sorry,
Wilson was
thank
such
you.
an advocate
Yep.
for integrating LSD into their, step program that
Hmm.
he almost got kicked out of his own organization because he wouldn't
Exactly.
stop talking about it. So he was an
Exactly.
advocate. It was just suppressed by others at the time.
Yeah, and also just parenthetically, after Jung's death, the correspondence between him and Jung about the spiritual experience of drug use um, were kind of published, and
Yeah,
so it seems like a lot of this is coming full circle,
yeah.
and obviously, I believe MDMA was not approved by the FDA, I think, in the last round, right?
No, not yet.
Not
But
yet.
there are literally hundreds of clinical
Mm-hmm.
trials
Yep.
with psychedelics and psychedelic derived compounds. So it's very likely that within the next few years, they will start getting approved as pharmaceuticals
Mm-hmm.
basically. So
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't seem like it's going to happen immediately, but in the very near future, so during this decade, people fully expect to have some of these compounds approved. But
Yeah.
I had to go back to what you said about Carl Jung because um, Jung and Jungian derived theories are incredibly prevalent in the psychedelic underground,
Yep.
and it's if you're like a cultural anthropologist, I mean, this would be, sociologist, this would be really fascinating to go into
Mm-hmm.
because when psychedelics were criminalized, the psychedelic movement, psychedelic therapy, it was out of institutions, but it
Yep.
didn't go away. It went underground.
Exactly.
And then there's been this sort of like parallel and even separate evolution of the psychedelic underground from the academic researchers and other researchers. So, it's really fascinating when you now have psychedelic conferences that bring everyone together. It's really interesting to see just how so much of the interpretive framework is based on Jung and it's
Mm-hmm.
based on people that were influenced by Jung, like Stan
Mm-hmm.
Grof and such.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're like an academic psychologist, this is like 1960s. Like this is what
Yep.
was popular in like the late 1960s, and the human potential movement and all that, like new age, new age kind of thing. So it's really kind of fascinating. So really, um, I like to think of this psychedelic world, compared to my other fields. It's not just an entirely different animal. It's like a zoo. It's like it's a zoo of all these different fantastic creatures.
Right. And I think some of the challenges, I mean, ketamine assisted therapy has kind of become more mainstream. I see advertisements here in the Western New York area all the time.
Yeah.
And so I think the movement is moving forward. I think you're right about that. But I think the challenges now are going to be um, not only approval but also affordability and access in terms of in an equitable way. Because I know right now ketamine is pretty expensive for therapy and is a
Yeah.
deterrent. Yeah.
Yeah. And the legal psychedelic, in Colorado, Oregon, legal psychedelic therapy with psilocybin, for example,
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, that could be like $6,000
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
course of treatment, and it's not currently covered by insurance.
Right.
So there are some people who could afford it, and to tell the truth, they might see the value in that investment. Having a substantial return on investment, even for something that costs as much as like, a possible like a used car or something. Uh,
Hmm.
but that is definitely a barrier. So there are folks who have been talking about, well, what about group therapy? What about,
Hmm.
community-based, groups? And there's research now. Now I just saw a recent study coming out about, you know um, sort of like a group psychedelic session, and how that process could be successful. But there's a lot of people who are very interested in uh, decriminalization, basically deprioritization of law enforcement for the laws that are on the books regarding psychedelics, and they feel that would enable the emergence of sort of community-based psychedelic groups, people, sort of like AA, where you're helping guide each other.
Hmm. Hmm. Which is probably already the infrastructure is kind of there. It just needs to be tapped into in many ways. I mean, the
Yeah.
populations that you found are a good example of that.
Yeah, well, and that's a challenge where there's a lot of people in need, and there's an
Hmm.
underground, but you could be in the same city and you would have no clue. Like, well, how do I,
Exactly.
how do I reach
Yeah,
these people?
exactly.
Especially when it is something that's illegal and people could go to prison, uh, for these kinds of activities. They're going to be really cautious about, who they would bring in, right? So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, it's a real dilemma,
This
and
is our bad. I'm sorry for talking over you. This is our bad habit of putting obstacles into services that actually could help people. We just have a knack for this. I don't know why we do it over and over, but
yeah.
we
Well,
do.
there are concerns, but if anything, it looks like both cannabis and psychedelics w would actually work. Not only would you look at them through the lens of harm reduction in terms of reducing the risk of harm from the substances themselves, but also reducing people's alcohol use, reducing
Yeah.
people's opiate use. So that's another angle, to think about it, and maybe to educate people on just the diversity of drug classes and how certain drugs are much more dangerous than others. So in a way, you could think of it as harm reduction. If you're taking something that's far more dangerous and replacing it with something that, does have risks, but is less dangerous.
Hmm. Absolutely. All right. So if we still have some time left, but what I wanted to do is so I mean we're primarily a social work podcast,
Mhm.
so I was going to try and be a little selfish here toward the end of our discussion. So social work is and I know you work with social workers, and you know that social work is big on the whole environment community knowledge, social justice, and even harm reduction as an ethical approach to practice education and
Mhm.
research. And so I wanted to ask you, based on your collaboration and, your knowledge of social work, um, if I could ask you to try to talk a little bit about what you feel are the implications of the work that you're doing and what you're learning about this are for social work practice, and including, you know, we could start with practice, but we could also talk about education and research,
Mhm.
because I'm you probably know this. I mean, even given what you said earlier, there's not a lot of courses, at least in our curriculum, that would teach this to practitioners. So in some ways, those barriers exist. So I know that's a long-winded question, but essentially, what do you think might be, at least for you, the implications for social work practice?
Well, you're really hitting on some important points there. And one thing you're mentioning is you absolutely have to be informed about these substances and about the dynamics of people using them. So we've
Hmm.
done a lot of work where we basically look at the relationship between the medicinal use of cannabis and mainstream healthcare, or the therapeutic use of psychedelics and primary care providers, and point out that there's a huge gap right now. There's a huge gap, and
Mm.
people who use these substances often don't trust their care providers because, in part, stigma, but and they're doing something they don't want to get in trouble for, but also in a large part because they don't think that their providers are informed enough. They don't think they're knowledgeable enough.
Yeah.
And guess what? They're not, because we've done that research too. We actually created a knowledge test about psychedelics and cannabis, and we find that, right, this is not something that was really covered, in their training. So
Mm.
so knowledge is moderate at best, and that becomes a problem, because you have this communication gap. If your clients, if
Hmm.
your patients aren't telling you about this stuff that they're doing because they don't think you know enough about it, you wouldn't be able to handle it, you couldn't relate to it, that's a problem, especially for something as significant as psychedelic use, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, so you definitely have the education. Like, even if somebody has no interest in taking these substances themselves, that's fine. But you have to understand it. You have to understand it and understand what other people might be experiencing. So that so that is key. You want to have that. You want to have that education there. And actually, some of the collaborators I work with have degrees in social work, right?
Hmm.
And right
Hmm.
now they're underground psychedelic therapy practitioners, but this is an emerging field, okay? In not many years, during this decade, we will see legal psychedelic therapy. But right
Hmm.
now, a lot of it, right now, especially with the current ketamine model, is kind of just like bring someone into a center and give them the drugs, right, and then send them on their way. Uh, a lot of people in the psychedelic community and research, research is documenting this, really believe that you know you need you need the therapy. If somebody has PTSD, or treatment resistant depression, having a psychedelic experience might be wonderful, but you really maximize the benefits, you really get the most out of it if you have that whole, the therapeutic preparation and
Hmm.
integration, long
Integration.
afterwards.
Yeah.
And in 5 years, I mean, that literally may be a viable career path for people, because the people who are administering the substances, um, they don't have time for it. But you couldn't just go to any old therapist, because they would have no idea what you're talking about, right? So
Right.
um, so so for social work, honestly, not I mean, it's not for may not be for everyone, but it really does look like there's actually going to be a viable career path in the near future. So those are things to be aware of. But then, then putting on the academic hat and talking about, the philosophy behind it, this project really embodies epistemic justice, right?
Nice.
Recognizing the value of knowledge in marginalized communities, that was traditionally devalued or ignored, and
Mm,
bringing that into the light. And that's a big theme in my work, my work with my collaborators is,
hmm
um, to daylight all this knowledge that's in the underground, and
hmm
even translate it for practical advice and practical applications.
Well, we better get good at it. I mean, I think social workers are now and have been for a number of years now the largest providers of behavioral health and mental health services in the country. So I think it would be about time that we understand that legitimizing harm reduction is actually ethical social work practice. If we believe that, we would expand our assessment. I know quite accidentally in my practitioner career, I didn't call it integration, but I found myself helping my clients integrate some of the experiences, positive ones, mostly that they had had when using substances. So I think, again, with typical of social work, we should be in on the ground floor and not be reactive to these movements. And I'm thrilled to hear that you're collaborating with them, with social workers.
Yeah, it's very everything you say is very true.
The other thing that I really liked about your your paper and your study is, and also I think this comes along to social work practice implications, is that when you spoke to people in the community who were using in the community, your focus was on real life experiences
Mhm.
as opposed to points of view that are kind of baked into with ideology, preconceived ideas. And I think social workers and other health professionals, we're people and we bring some of that closed mindedness to our interactions as well. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm doing too much talking. I want you to talk about what you think the implications are for social work practice, if you have any more.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that's, I think these are all good points to make. And on the note that you said, I think especially people who, are getting into these positions, they've worked hard. They've studied a lot. They have, long time horizons. Uh, Sometimes I think it would be valuable for, folks, whether they're in an academic position or in therapy, have to realize that not everyone is like them, and not everyone makes the choices that they would make. And this is one of my big, rants about some of these fields, is that I think there's very little understanding of what the world and what life is actually like for most folks. I mean, so many academics, they grew up in a very comfortable suburban environment. Their parents went to college, they were expected to go to college, they studied hard. They might have, sure, they had some fun, but, for the most part, they were just working hard and trying to get ahead, and, very long time horizons. And, and they just assume that, well, everyone's like that, right? So, you know, why so it's like if everyone had the opportunity, they would make the same choices that they made. you
Right.
know and I'm all about infrastructure. Like I would love to have, um, like European style, mass transit systems and everything, universal healthcare. I'm all about the infrastructure, but I also think that people make choices, and people have different motivations, and some
Absolutely.
people are motivated just to have fun. And it's like, well, I
Mhm.
just want to have a good time, and
Mhm.
yeah, of course they want to be healthy. Of course they want to be healthy, but there's trade-offs. And sometimes people do things that might put them at risk just because they want to live an enjoyable life. And that's something you just kind of have to realize about about people.
And I dare people to make the argument that there's something wrong with that. Wanting to have fun. So,
Well, our nation was founded by Puritans, right? Or at least some of the first English speaking Europeans that came over.
well,
So
yeah, I'm having all sorts of thoughts there, Dan, that I'm going to leave now for
yeah,
the interest
for
of
next
time.
time.
Yeah, for next time. But we are kind of bumping up against our time limit. So first of all, I want to thank you. This is right up my alley. I hope listeners really like this and use this. And we'll post a link, some show notes with a link to your paper if people want to kind of read, do the deeper dive. But here at the end, I've asked you a bunch of questions. Do you have any concluding thoughts or comments that you really want to make sure that you get in here before we say goodbye?
Sure, yeah, I do want to say, some of the standard, disclaimers about research that, this is a survey project and we're asking people's, basically their opinions about things, their advice, and we get a lot of content from that, which I think has a lot of value, but we really need to validate some of these things. We need more systematic research where we're actually like testing out harm reduction techniques.
Yep.
We want this all empirically verified. So I think we're hopefully opening the door, a little bit more, but much more research is needed before we could say, well, we have all the answers, and we want to, we we know all there is to know about this.
Hmm. Which has been, I think, the problem as we attempt to help people with this in clinical settings for a while. So hopefully we can change that. Dan Kruger, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Well, it's great to talk with you, Peter. I look forward to the next time.
Wonderful. Thanks again to Dr. Daniel Kruger for joining us today. The tuned in and often turned on team at the In Social Work podcast are Steve Sturman, our tech and web guru, Ryan Trofe, our GA production assistant and guest coordinator. Ryan.
Hello.
And I'm Peter Sabota. We'll see you next time, everybody.